Cromford report in national news says buyer interest is starting to wane. We're going to cover section 2 of the contract, financing, where we discuss all the things that the buyer suddenly has to do in their contract. And we are potentially days away from hundreds of thousands of people suddenly being homeless. And you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction. And it's episode 26 of the Unnamed Real Estate Podcast. I'm Charles Ray Dawson, Associate Broker with ProStar Realty. And does anybody else have Barry Maguire stuck in their head? That's the problem with you when you're using a teaser liner like that and you try to use a title that's a song lyric, is that in the back of my mind, I do have the Eve of Destruction going over and over and over again in my head, and probably will for the rest of this podcast. But thanks for tuning in, everybody. Recording at home. I got Charlie, my handyman, is replacing a couple faucets in my house. Little rule of thumb, guys, especially in the utility room. Keep an eye on your faucets. Keep an eye on your hose bibs. Anything going on back there. They tend to get ignored. They start getting a little crusty on the outside. And since we're having Charlie come through, and that was sort of one of the things I had on the project list to make sure we get done in the house. I honestly think we're replacing one of those things like probably in the last 6 months of its lifespan. And when those things go, you might not notice it for a while as it's just throwing water all over the place. We're also replacing them with a type of faucet that is easier to turn off and is less likely to freeze up. I met my next door neighbor a couple years ago at 10 o'clock at night when she was banging on my door hysterical because the hose itself had actually sheared off. Going to her washing machine, and the knob itself had actually frozen, so she was unable to turn off the water, and it's just pouring into her house, probably flooded a good half of it. She didn't know about the external valve to turn off all the water to her house. She didn't know those things existed. Unfortunately, I was able to turn that off for her. She got a plumber out there, and it was just an absolute mess. So when I'm working with first-time homebuyer or any homebuyer, I always point out, hey, here's your turn off. I tell them that story so it cements in their mind. If you suddenly get a leak and you have frozen faucets, you got to turn the water off to the house. If you are sitting there and you're certainly wondering yourself, how do I turn the water off to my house? Go take a look around. Normally it's where the main water line is. It might be one of those old turn knobs. It might be a nice ball valve with a handle on it. If it's not a ball valve with a handle, you might want to look at getting that replaced. It will save you a lot of heartache. A lot of heartache later on in life. So just one of those joys of home ownership. So starting with the numbers and everything, Melissa and Tina in the Cromford report, our buyers' interests are down to 105. Anywhere between 90 and 110 is considered normal. We came down from where we were highs. I think we were like 118, 117. I'm recording at home today, and of course I left all my notes at the office last night because I didn't know I was going to be here all day today. But so we're looking at 105 on those numbers. Our seller side we're up in at 28 if I remember right. So we are starting to come down. We're still historically low for sellers and historically low for housing and listings, and we're going to cover that when we cover the weekly numbers, although we did come up again. So that's not the big news. We've been seeing that trend happen for the last couple of weeks. Bigger news that are coming up is the moratorium on evictions is set to end on the 31st. Today is the 29th, so we are 2 days out. Potentially that means that a lot of people on the 1st of August are going to be notified by their landlords that it is time to leave, and we're going to start eviction processes. There was a last minute move I just saw this morning by the Biden administration, who is asking Congress specifically to pass a bill to extend that, which means that they got 48 hours to do something very, very quick, and this is government. So we'll see what happens with that. You guys might remember that last month the Supreme Court came out and ruled that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, did not have the constitutional authority to tell landlords, hey, you can't evict people because of COVID, or if they're impacted by COVID. And the Supreme Court eventually did rule that says, no, the executive does not have the legal authority to make a declarative statement like that. That's something that has to come out from Congress. I'm not sure why it took 2 days before deadline to suddenly ask Congress. That's something Congress should have been working on, in the interim. But hey, we're moving at the speed of Washington, D.C. on these things. So we'll see what happens over the next couple of days. And I'm definitely going to talk about what happens next week. So if you are, I just wanted to point this out. About 3 weeks ago, I got a instant message from a friend. And it was one of those, hey, I have a person who may be having a real estate emergency. Can I give them your number? They might need a realtor ASAP. And I'm like, my first gut instinct was, oh my God, not another buyer. But there's a lot of air quote real estate emergencies that are slow moving emergencies, and you see them coming months in advance, or at least you should see them coming months in advance. When you are suddenly getting the eviction notice, it's way, way too past the point where Ray can help you or any other real estate agent can help you, especially in this market. There is no way we're going to turn around and be able to get you a rental in the next 2 days. Now, an eviction notice, it should be along the lines of, 10 days notice on the door, going through the court process. So it's not like instantaneous, but it's also not a multi-month process. So if you have an individual out there who's just, what's going to happen, right? This is not where one day you knock on the door and all of a sudden there's a notice right there saying, hey, get out. You knew your lease was up. You knew your lease was coming up. You knew you weren't making the rent payments. You needed to start maneuvering back then to deal with the ramifications of what happens now when you actually do get the notice. Same thing with foreclosures. You're not making the mortgage payment. This is not news to you. I'm still trying to find anybody who specifically came out that says this moratorium on evictions also applies to foreclosures. I do know this. The feds have been talking to the banks going, you guys really, really need to make this easy on the consumer or we're going to make it hard on you. But we don't know how that thing's going out. But if you're sitting there and if you're in forbearance and you've been sitting in forbearance for a couple months and you realize you're just hopefully just going, okay, hopefully they're just going to be able to let us tack that onto the back end. They may or may not do that. So it's good to have your options open. What happens if you do suddenly get that, hey, you got 90 days to pay in full, or we're going to start foreclosure on you, or you got 30 days, or whatever that amount is, pay us now. Know what your options are, right? Know what your options are. Know what the value of your house is, right? Do not let your place go into foreclosure if you have equity in there. And in certain cases, I was talking to Pat Diamede. He's, remember him from one of our first episodes. I think he was actually my first interview. There's a chance that you may be able to refinance that even if you are in forbearance, because they're not reporting that to the credit agency. So as far as the credit agencies are concerned, you're still solid. And if you can qualify for the loan that you need to get out of that loan and into your new loan with your reduced income, you might want to look into doing that. So don't wait till the last second, guys, right? And that's a little editorial that's been building up in me, and I didn't want to pop out like that, but that seems to be the par for the course on how most of these things go. So we do have that coming down the pike. We might get saved by Congress at the last second, or this time Monday, we might be looking at a completely different world with a whole bunch of people suddenly get noticed to get out. Recording from home today, so we get interrupted every once in a while. First things first, let's start with this week's numbers. Now the numbers for July 28th, 2021. Actives this week are 6,392, which is up 132 from last week, continuing the growth there. Of those, that 2,440 of them are new listings that just came on in the last week, which is down 87 from the week before. Our pendings are at 1,815, which is down 95, and we have 1,171 new under contract looking for backups, and 99 buyer contingency sales. We have a closings of 2017, which is down 266 from the week before, anticipating the spike at the end of the month with the rush in closings. And coming soon is 887, which we'll be seeing coming into the market sometime in the next 4 weeks. So as you can see with those numbers, we do seem to be we're still adding properties, and we're still getting more properties on the market than we have for the last year or so, or at least this year. Then we do see things are starting to slow up a little bit on the pendings, and we're starting to see more offers being accepted, looking with buyer's contingencies, meaning they have to sell their own place. And we're starting to see what's called seasonality, right? This is July, August. These are the slow months, supposedly. And so since this is not a normal year, and last year definitely was not a normal year, we really start comparing ourselves to 2019, which was a good year for real estate. And we're starting to get closer to those numbers and everything. So that return to normalcy. But once again, we're seeing to start to back off on the buyer side. There's less of them out there. This does not mean that you're still not in the middle of a bidding war on these things. It just means that instead of the 20 offers per house, now maybe you're seeing 12. And as we start backing off into these things, you're still going to be, we still start seeing ourselves in a seller's market, but it's not that insane frenzy that we're talking before. It's just a normal traditional seller's market. So with that being said, part of the contract, and part of the things that when we get into the contract and we're starting coming out of this less frenzy is that you start seeing things where sellers are looking at having to pay a little bit for the buyer's costs and whatnot. And we're going to cover that here in section 2. So let's go into section 2, and then we'll do a wrap up right at the end. Now, in our last video, we covered section 1 of the purchase contract, which we called out who's the buyer, who's the seller, what's the property being transacted, what's the price that's being paid for it, and when do we expect to close, and what kind of items included in the house are we expecting to be included. Part 2 is the financing section, and the financing is the section that is going to describe the rights and responsibilities to everybody. There's a lot of buyer shalls in this second section. All right, the buyer shall do this, buyer shall do that. This is mostly to define clearly how the buyer is planning on paying for the property. Now, at the top of the line, you can see just it's at the very end of section 1 that if it's an all-cash sale, we're going to skip this part entirely and go straight to section 3. But the majority of purchases out there by first-time buyers are going to be people who are taking out a loan. So section 2 comes into play. And starting off in section 2, the first line in here is a prequal line. It's a AR prequalification form is attached here too and incorporated here by reference. This is the prequal letter is the letter that we're going to have your lender give to you first, normally before we even start looking at houses. Some agents are comfortable doing that, taking people out, wasting their gas and time on somebody who does not have a prequal letter. It is a security risk to the individual agent. Most brokers out there strongly discourage that kind of behavior. And I've gotten calls from people before, not working with me, but from other states is, hey, this person won't show me this house. And I'm like, why won't they show you the house? And they're like, well, we need to get a prequal letter first. And you need to understand that for the agent, a random person calling up out of the blue and saying, come meet me at this time over here, it can be a warning flag. You get a lot of looky-loos. You get neighbors who just want to see the inside of the house to snoop around. And unfortunately, there has been, I would say at least once a year, the real estate community gets to notice that so-and-so never came back from a showing. We use the term, she never returned home. She didn't cross home plate. And later we find out she was, done away with, axe murdered, whatever. We had a guy in Kingman here, was it Wickenburg? No, it was Kingman, disappear a couple years ago. He got a signed call, went out there to meet somebody, never came home. So this is something agents take very seriously, and if you are an agent, you should be taking this very seriously. And if this is the first time it's ever crossed your mind that you could be meeting a stranger in some place who might want something besides just buying the house, I'm sorry to, to introduce you to the harsh realities of the world, but this is the harsh realities of the world. So anybody out there who's watching this, I hope now you understand why agents are so serious about making sure you have pre-qualified. If nothing else, that means the lender is going to have the social security number of the person, the agent last met for a place where the police can start the investigation. So, editorial aside on that, let's go back to prequals. The prequal letter is included as reference, and there are a lot, and it actually becomes part of the contract by reference, all right? Because there are things in here that is constantly referencing what that line, what's on that documentation. So, next line on this is Section 2B, and we're talking about what's called a loan contingency. This is your first punch-out point for the buyer to get their earnest money back if the transaction does not close. All right. The loan contingency, all right, states that the buyer's obligation to complete the sale is contingent upon the buyer getting loan approval without prior to document conditions no later than 3 days prior to the close of escrow date for the loan described in the AR loan status update, right, which is a document that is going to be provided by the lender. We're going to cover that here a little bit too. So to break all that thing down, what is that in that prequal, it's going to say not just how much you can borrow, but how are you borrowing it? Is it going to be a conventional loan? Is it going to be an FHA loan? Are you using a gift letter or a gift money? Are you getting a buyer's assistance through some other organization? So all these things coming down on this, informs the seller about what type of buyer you are, and it's securing you as the buyer in case you cannot get that specific loan. All right, but you could theoretically get another loan. You're not obligated to continue the purchase of the house just because there is a type of loan you could get. So you really want to call that. If you want to use a conventional loan or an FHA loan, you can't be held responsible for not closing if you could have gotten a conventional loan. Right? That's what makes these documents so important to you, the buyer, especially when we're putting into this contract. Because continuing on in Section 2B. All right. No later than 3 days prior to the close of escrow date, buyer shall either sign all the loan documents or deliver to the seller or escrow company notice of loan approval without prior to document conditions and date of receipt of closing disclosures from the lender, or deliver to the seller or escrow company notice of the inability to obtain loan approval without prior to document conditions. Now, I just said the word prior to document conditions about 3 times in there. That is a lender term that they use. All right, that a prior to document conditions is the lender needs something from the buyer before they can actually send the loan documents out. All right, so that's a prior to document condition. You have prior to documents and you have post documents. So some of these things is like, did you send your last bank statement? Did you send an explanation letter? Whatever the lender is asking you at this point, all right, you need to be ready to go within 3 days prior to close of escrow. Now, I mentioned back there in the first the video before this about how there's a lot of things triggered by the close of escrow date, and there's a lot of things that has to happen on set time periods before that close of escrow date, and this is one of them. Now, in a perfect world, every buyer out there would be signing the documents 3 days before close of escrow. That would give escrow plenty of time to work the documents up, the lender plenty of time to review the documents, plenty of time to wire them funds over to escrow, plenty of time for escrow to disperse. In reality, that I would say that maybe happens 30 to 40% of the time. A lot of times what happens is you're going to be doing that, and you're just going to be letting them know, hey, we're going to sign and fund either on the same day or the day directly before. So when you are on the seller side of this thing and somebody's sending an offer over to you, you're calling that lender up before you even accept the offer and going, hey, we got a closing date here 30 days out. Are you going to be able to meet that? Most lenders will say, yeah, sure, no problem. We can close in 30 days. Hey, we can close in 31 days. Whatever it's going to take. But, that's something, seller, buyer, there's nothing worse than me sitting there the day you're supposed to be closing and you're not closing that day, and you don't even have a firm date. Why? Because the file's over there in lender land somewhere, and you have no idea what's going on, and the communication is really poor. So this is, getting back to this is one of those things. The buyer is sitting here saying, I'm going to be signing documents 3 days before a close of escrow, or I'm going to give you a notice, all right, that we are approved with that prior to docs, and the date of receipt of a closing disclosure is from the lender. We did receive the closing disclosures from the lenders, or we're sending you a letter saying we're not going to be able to do this. All right. So one thing about that closing disclosures, the CD, that's a document that comes out from the lender like the last possible second before the documents go out. And it is a firm, this is what your closing costs are going to be. This is what we're charging. This is what your interest rate is. And by law, once that closing disclosure is sent to the buyer, lender stops. Right? They have, you as the borrower have 3 days to review these documents, that it's probably going to take you about an hour to review, but the federal government wants you to have 3 days, so the whole world stops there while you're going through these closing disclosures, and then you can do the documents. So that's all carried under 2B. 2C is your punch out, because if the buyer is unable to get the loan, if the buyer loses their job in escrow, if the buyer quits their job in escrow, if the something happens where the buyer is no longer able to get the money from the borrower, the buyer can cancel out and get their earnest money back. And there's a couple lines in this contract to give you the conditions of that, right? One is it has to be after a diligent and good faith effort. So if the lender calls you up and says, I'm not giving you the loan because you have not signed these documents I needed you to, you have not sent me the documentation over, and you're not getting the loan, right, that's an unfulfilled loan, but since you haven't done a diligent and good faith effort, your earnest money could be at risk on that. Right. If the buyer is unable to obtain loan approval without prior to document conditions and delivers a notice of inability no later than 3 days prior to the close of escrow, the buyer can get their earnest money back. So, hey, I lost my job, I can't buy the house. Okay, we notify, we're exercising the unfulfilled loan contingency. The lender will not loan money to somebody who doesn't have a job. Right? You get your earnest money back. Now, it's on the seller side. Is that if we're inside of 3 days prior to close of escrow and we have not received notice that we have documents on the way, the seller can issue a cure notice. Right? We're going to discuss that down in 7B. A cure notice saying you need to rectify the situation. You have 3 days to do it. Right? If after those 3 days the buyer does not send the letter over and says, I'm not getting the loan, then the seller can get the earnest money. Right. But if the buyer sends that letter over saying, I'm not getting the loan, during that 3 day period, the buyer gets it. So it's really big on communication at this point. So if you are not getting the loan at this is the paragraph that gets you your earnest money back, if it was at no fault of your own. Now, Section 2D is a little bit of legalese in here. It just says that if you did not lock your loan rate in, and all of a sudden you don't qualify for the loan because the rates went up too high, now your monthly payment is too high, and the lender's not going to lend it to you, that's not a condition necessary to do the unfulfilled loan contingency. So if you're in escrow and you got yourself a nice little 3% interest rate loan, and the market's crashed tomorrow, next you know all the loans are out there at 12%. You can't afford that house at 12% interest rate because you did not have the loan locked in and the rate locked in. All right, you might not get your earnest money on this. All right, so that's Section 2D. So 2E is one of those things it's a buyer shall line. The buyer shall deliver to the seller the LSU, which is a loan status update, with a minimum of lines 1 through 40 completed describing the current status of the buyer's proposed loan within 10 days after contract acceptance, and instruct lenders to provide an updated LSU to brokers and sellers upon request. The buyer is being charged with the responsibility to deliver that. But that's something that the lender is going to do for you. When we're farther down in escrow, you're going to see a lot of stuff that the seller's being charged what to do. And escrow is actually doing it for the seller. But the verbiage of it really puts the onus on the buyer at this point. So loan status update, seller's going to be getting updates where we are at the loan process. Is everything getting checked off, or or the W-2s getting provided, all that good stuff. Going on to our next page here. All right. It sounds weird, but we had to put in here on Section 2F, all right, that the buyer actually has to cooperate with the lender and start trying to get the loan. And we specifically call out that you have to give the lender your name, your income, your social security number, your premises address, the property being purchased, estimate of value of the premise. That's not an appraisal. It's just an estimate, and usually they just use the purchase price on it, and the amount that you want to borrow. All right, and grant the lender permission to access the buyer's tri-merge residential credit report. Right. So back up here where we were talking about the responsibilities of the buyer, to try to get the loan. This one right here is actually calling out the specific things. If you have a problem with giving out your social security number to your lender's not going to loan you money unless they have your social security number. So you're not going to get the loan, but you don't get to use the unfulfilled loan contingency because it's calling out right here you agreed to do that. All right. Now, loan processing during escrow is Section 2G. All right. Now, within 10 days after receipt of the loan estimate, all right, buyer is going to provide lender with a notice of intent to proceed with a loan transaction in a manner satisfactory to lender. Once again, we're charging the buyer to work nice with the lender and to provide the lender all requested signed disclosures and the documentation listed in the LSU. All right, and the buyer agrees to diligently work to obtain the loan and will promptly provide the lender with all additional documentation requested. So that's the third time the contract is telling the buyer, you have to work with the lender. And if at some point the lender is not being worked with and you do not get the loan, you're putting your earnest money at risk. And I've taken a buyer's earnest money before because they pulled out, they used the excuse, hey, we didn't get the loan. I called the lender up. The lender has to tell me the truth. And the lender told me that the loan was being rejected because they failed to provide proper documentation. All right. That's a check to the seller and the house goes back on the market. All right, so that's what all of those lines up there through 2G, that's all it's talking about. Buyer, you're working with your lender. So 2H, we start identifying more things. We talk about the type of financing, whether or not this is a conventional loan, an FHA, a VA loan, a USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, if you're assuming the existing loan or doing something called a seller carryback. This is of interest to the seller because not all loans are different, and some of them have different burdens on the seller. A FHA or a VA loan, the appraisal is going to keep the house to a higher safety standard than in a conventional loan, so there is a chance that the seller might have to do repairs that they did not intend to. Other things in the certain VA loans, there's a couple fees that cannot be paid for by the buyer themselves. And so the seller might have increased closing costs, right? So you see a loan come across with a VA, good seller's agent is calling that lender up going, hey, what's your closing costs that you think my seller's going to have to pay for on this transaction? All right. Now, that being said, next line down, there's loan costs. All costs of obtaining the loan shall be paid by buyer unless otherwise provided for herein. Right. So mostly when you think about costs of obtaining a loan, you're thinking about stuff like if you're using seller or buyer's assistance program, sometimes they'll make you take a class, like a HUD class. All right, that could cost you about $100. The buyer's going to have to pay for that. Or the appraisal, right? If there's appraisal involved in the loan, and there will always be appraisal involved in the loan, the buyer's going to be paying for that. This is where the buyer is putting down there, I will pay for all these things. Now, Section 2G, or 2J, and this is something we used to see all the time. Have not seen a lot of it in the last couple months, although they are coming back in certain zip codes, is the seller's concession. The seller has, or the buyer has the option to ask, and the seller has the option to offer, that the seller is going to credit part of the purchase price to the buyer for buyer's closing costs. And that's the origination fees, escrow costs, any other expenditure that the buyer's getting charged by the lender. So these used to be really, really common back in 2014, which was considered a normal market here in Phoenix, where a house would be on the market for upward 45 or 60 days. And you'd have somebody coming in there with an FHA loan, and they had like a whole 3%, and they didn't have any closing costs. And they would ask the seller, hey, can you pony up 3% of the purchase price to help offset our closing costs? And that comes into a negotiation standpoint. So there's a line right there. If the seller, if the buyer was asking the seller to help, because theoretically the seller has this huge, massive potential cash called the house purchase, or the house price that they're going to be getting. Since they're flush with cash, they can help credit some of that back to the buyer, help the buyer offset their costs. Now, clever agents will bump up the offer. Let's say you're asking $350 for a house, and you're going to need $5,000, and a buyer comes in, but they're going to need $5,000 closing costs. They will write the offer for $355 and then ask for $5,000 of it back. That way, the seller's still getting their amount that they originally wanted by putting it on the market, and the buyer is effectively financing their closing costs, right? And so that was a common thing back then. It might be a common thing up right now. It's always something to keep in your quiver if you have a buyer without a lot of excess cash for buying, right? Line 2K. This one gets abused quite a bit, and as on your listing side, when you're on the listing side, and you really have to watch the buyers on this. Right? Because the buyer has to immediately notify the seller of any changes in the loan program, financing terms, or lender described in the pre-qualification form attached thereto or LSU provided within 10 days after contract acceptance, and shall only make any such changes without the prior written consent of the seller if the changes do not adversely affect buyers to obtain loan approval without prior to document conditions, increase the seller's closing costs, or delay close of escrow. So the buyers do this sometimes. For whatever reason, they decide to switch horses midstream. They're sitting there and they go, I just got something in the mail saying that these guys are offering me a rate, a point lower than what I'm paying now. Or my cousin just called me up and gave me the guilt trip because I didn't give her the work. Or whatever the reason is, they'll suddenly decide, or, hey, we just realized this, we're in a contract with a conventional loan, but if we do a VA loan on this, we don't have to come in with any money. Yay, us. And then they'll just switch the loan. Right? Especially in the case of going from a conventional to a VA or a conventional to an FHA. The buyer does not get to do that without written permission of the seller. All right? They can do it if there's no adverse effect of the buyer's ability to obtain the loan, increase the seller's closing costs, like VA costs or anything, or delay close of escrow. So the buyer suddenly comes up, and you're 2 weeks out of closing, and it's like, oh, we're changing to a new lender. Is that new lender going to be able to hit the same close of escrow date? If you can't, you still have to perform the contract as written on the prequal, or with the loan as written on the prequal, and you can't change over on that. So that's, like I said, it's a pretty common thing. A lot of agents don't actually read that line, and they just, they're so busy working the deal, trying to keep the deal alive, they don't realize that they needed the seller to sign off on it. Or they just didn't tell the buyer, hey, no, you can't do that. It's too late. If you wanted to have that lender or that loan package, you should have put that into advance before we even wrote the contract. So, line 2F. This is the appraisal contingency. This is the second one of this that is a buyer's punch out. And it's the buyer's obligation to complete the sale is contingent upon appraisal of the premises acceptable to the lender for at least the purchase price. If the premise fails to appraise for the purchase price or in any appraisal required by the lender, buyer has 5 days after the notice of the appraised value to cancel the contract and receive their earnest money back. All right. So this is a built-in boilerplate, and with FHA, VA, government-secured loans, there's always a separate document that comes in there that says, hey, separate document. The buyer can pull out of the contract and get their earnest money back if the house is not appraised for it. Strangely enough, they always send that thing way, way after the fact. Like sometimes you'll get that the day before closing to the seller who's supposed to sign it, and you've already argued everything out. So, but it's written here specifically in the contract, and it can be $1. Right? You're in a contract for $350, and it comes at $449,999. All right. Technically, that gives the buyer the right to pull out of that, and that's just to secure the buyer so they're not suddenly in a position where they have to borrow more money than they thought they were going to. So you're seeing a lot of times where buyers are waiving that, especially get a house under contract, or they're guaranteeing so much above the appraisal. So if you're at $350 and it appraises for $345, if the buyer says, and we'll pay up to $5,000 over, then the buyer's going to be coming up with an extra $5,000. And there's a specific document out there. It's that you can attach. There's a bunch of addendums you can attach to this contract, which is really the best way to handle that situation. You just fill in the blank. We're going to guarantee you up to 5, up to 10, whatever. So, but the appraisal contingency allows the buyer to pull out if the house does not appraise for what you're under contract. Down here, line 2M, we're talking, in section 2M, appraisal costs. It's going to call out who's going to be paying the appraisal fee. 99 times out of 100, the buyer is going to be paying for that appraisal fee as part of their costs. They have the option to ask the seller to do that. I've done that a couple times when the seller's asking price is so ridiculously high. I really don't think it's going to appraise at that. And it's like, okay, seller and seller's agent, put your money where your mouth is. You pay for the appraisal, and we'll see what happens. Right? If you, as up there before in 2J, we were doing some seller's credit to the buyer's cost. You can actually say the seller's going to pay for the appraisal, and it's going to count against or be applied against the seller's concessions at close of escrow. So that's another thing that buyers can do if they just do not have enough money to pay for an appraisal and a home inspection or whatever. So that the contract gives you an option to negotiate that out. So this is a short section right here, but very dense with information. Section 2, financing. Remember, we got our 2 punch outs between buyer couldn't qualify for the loan or the purchase didn't appraise. You see how many different times that the seller how the pre-qual letter and everything is sort of locking in the buyer to use that kind of loan, protects the sellers. All right, and you look at all the responsibilities of the buyer shall, and this is the part of the contract that's locking the buyer into working with their lender. So next video, we're going to be covering title and escrow, which is something near and dear to my heart because I worked for title and escrow companies for 15 years before I decided to be a real estate agent. And I've worked on the escrow side, the title side, and the background support side. And so I'm going to probably go into some detail and hopefully tell you some background stories about how the sausage gets made over there at the escrow world. So thank you very much for watching this part of the video. And there you go. That was section 2. As you can see, the buyer suddenly has a lot of things that they need to do. They're being called out specifically in the contract. Hey, you need to work nice with the lender and start getting them all the information. We covered the 2 different contingencies where the buyer doesn't get the loan or the property doesn't appraise. It allows the buyer to get out and get their earnest money back. And we also covered that little line that's going to start becoming more and more important where, when you have a buyer that's coming in and they need help on the closing costs, the seller can start kicking back onto them. So next week when we cover this, it's going to be section 3. We're going to start discussing escrow. It's going to be a really, really short one. Contractually, there's not a lot of lines there, but this is something I can talk a lot about, and I probably will. So thank you very much for watching episode 26. Next week is going to be episode 27, and thank you very much for listening to the Unnamed Real Estate Podcast.